you would do this for us. So thank you.
Of course, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, and I know we have an hour, so we will try to stick to that. We can talk to you until breakfast, I think, but we'll try and be disciplined. So everybody has your bio. They have read the book. They have watched a video, I think, of you, an interview, and have seen the reviews, which are just amazing and fabulous. So as you and I talked about, I'm just going to spend a minute on you and then give us to you for 5 or 10 minutes to talk about whatever you want to tell us. We would just, eat it up. And then I think we'll get to as many questions as we can from the book club. There are many more. And there's some of my Penn students here. There are a lot of friends from Philadelphia. So you see a mix of us, big fan club. So as you all know, Catherine's from Chicago. She has an undergraduate degree in history from Harvard and then an MPhil in modern European history from Christ College in Cambridge. Went into finance briefly, thank God, briefly, because you got out of it and wrote this spectacular book and hopefully more. And I think you wrote this book when you were 27 and 28. And I guess you finished it when you were beginning Harvard Law School, something like that. So it's just staggering that you've done that so young and so beautifully. So anyway, and now you're at Harvard Law School and you're graduating in May.
I am, yes.
Yeah. So with that, we'd love to hear what you want to, tell us up front for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'll come back and start the questions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time on what I now know is a very big afternoon for everyone. And thank you so much, Elizabeth, for organizing all of this. I've really been looking forward to it. And before we jump into your excellent questions, I thought I'd just share a little bit of the story behind the story and maybe a couple of photographs and a map just to kind of, place the discussion. But I hope that you haven't watched too many videos or anything, because then I don't know if I'll say anything new.
No.
Something new to share.
No, hardly anything. So please go ahead.
Yeah, so I grew up in Winnetka, Illinois, just north of Chicago, home of the movie Home Alone that was filmed in my town. So we've had a number of people flocking to Winnetka to see the Home Alone house the last couple of weeks. And I was really fortunate to grow up in a family that loved to read. My mom would read to us all the time when we were growing up. She'd read to us before bed, of course, but then we'd spend a lot of time in the afternoons in the summer we had a nice screened porch, and she'd sit and read to us all sorts of English children's classic literature, Harry Potter, Little House on the Prairie, all these wonderful stories. And I think that really helped me have a very lively imagination from the time I was a little girl. And I also loved history from as far back as I can remember. My mom had these books of some British history kind of coffee table books I'd sit and flip through and look at, a book about the crown jewels and the Tower of London that I loved. And my grandfather served in the Navy during World War II. He was an officer in the Navy. And I would chase him around with a little pad of paper at family holidays and ask him to tell me his stories about growing up in Montana during the Great Depression, going east to Notre Dame for college, and then being an officer in the Navy during the war. And so I was kind of always the family's self-appointed historian. And a lot of the stories that I came to love about World War II, especially, were from the movies that I loved when I was growing up. Things like The Sound of Music, which I'd watch every time I was sick home from school, White Christmas, and The Great Escape. It was actually The Great Escape that really stayed with me, writing my 8th grade term paper about it. And then when I was in college, I wrote my senior thesis at Harvard about British prisoner of war escape narratives and their role in British culture. And this is what actually first triggered an interest in Winston Churchill for me. Actually not Churchill during World War II, as most people know him, but actually Churchill as a young man during the Boer War, when he was just 24 years old. He was captured, he was a POW, and he managed to make this thrilling escape. And it was the story of his escape, which launched him to fame in Britain and really jumpstarted his political career. After that, I was really fortunate to have the opportunity to go to Cambridge, which is something I'd wanted to do since I was about 5 years old, kind of looking at all my mom's books about British history, and had the chance to continue studying history there. And for someone who's historically inclined, there really is no better environment to be fully immersed in and surrounded by history and live kind of amongst the thing that you're writing about. And so while I was there, I wrote about early counterintelligence practices during the First World War. and this massive postal censorship program that the British government instituted in hopes of trying to find enemy German spies that might be lurking in their midst by reading all the in and outbound foreign mail. This triggered a problem with the Americans when we were still neutral, because the right to privacy had emerged as a legal concept here in a way that it had not yet in Britain. And that made me start thinking about maybe applying to law school. And I had another chance to really study Churchill in depth, but again, not during World War II. In fact, this time when he was the Home Secretary overseeing the program of postal censorship during World War I. And then, like every other person in my class, it felt like I decided that I didn't know kind of what history had in store for me, but maybe I'd come back to it as a writer, kind of as a second career or something. And then I decided I'd move to New York and leave behind pastoral idyllic Cambridge for the hustle and bustle of New York City, where I was working at BlackRock as a financial analyst in the alternative investments group. And when I just couldn't take any more of the Excel modeling, I would wander down to the lobby to get a coffee, but also because there was a bookstore in the lobby of my office called Chartwell Booksellers, which specializes in books by and about Winston Churchill. And it's just kind of this twist of irony that here I was in the middle of Manhattan. I thought I was done with history, and here was this bookstore. So I'd go in there many an afternoon and have a chat with the owner, who I think was rather amused that here was this 24-year-old female financial analyst who was so interested in history and Winston Churchill. And shortly thereafter, he introduced me to a group called the International Churchill Society, which was having a dinner across the street from my office at the Waldorf featuring Madeleine Albright as keynote speaker. And I'd always wanted to hear her speak. And so I asked, do you think that they would need someone to check coats or show someone to their table? I'm happy to volunteer just for a chance to hear her speak. And he said, no, I'm sure that they would be very happy to have a young person who's excited about history just come and join them. And so sure enough, the director of the society said, yes, of course, come on over. And while I was there, not only did I have the opportunity to hear Secretary Albright, I also got to meet several members of the Churchill family who were involved in the International Churchill Society, which is made up of scholars and academics, but also lawyers and doctors and engineers and people of all different walks of life that want to encourage people to study history, foreign policy, diplomacy, and kind of use those skills in the spirit of Winston Churchill in furtherance of kind of Churchillian ideas today. And so shortly thereafter, the Churchill Society was the Churchill family was opening the papers of Winston's middle daughter, Sarah, for the first time at Churchill College in Cambridge. And they asked if I'd be interested in writing an article about them for the Churchill Society's magazine. And I said yes, thinking just this would be a fun way to stay engaged with history and do a little writing. Meanwhile, I was starting to apply to law school. And so I had a chance to go back to Cambridge, which was exciting to me, and look at these papers of Sarah Churchill and be the first person to do this. But the other reason I was really excited about it was because I had had sort of an experience, you could say, with Sarah Churchill from the time I was really little. My family goes to the cloister at Sea Island in Georgia every summer, and Sarah Churchill had actually eloped there with her second husband in 1949. And there's this beautiful picture of Sarah that hung on the wall of the lobby that I'd seen every summer since I was literally a year old. And it just kind of felt like all these different threads of life had come together. And as soon as I started reading about her and her life, I was amazed not only by what she had experienced as an actress, her work during the war, but especially the very close bond that she had with her father and her ability to understand him in a way that nobody else could, aside from perhaps her mother, Clementine. And so the deeper I got into it, the more I became interested and realized that not only had she accompanied her father to Tehran and Yalta, but that her work as a daughter diplomat at Tehran had inspired FDR and Averell Harriman to then bring their daughters to Yalta. And I couldn't believe no one had told the story before, but partly because the sources were not available to tell it yet. And I knew that this was a chance that wasn't to be missed. So I ended up deferring starting at Harvard Law for 2 years, did a lot of the research, wrote the first draft of the book, and then finished writing it during my first year at Harvard Law. So that made for an interesting 1L fall if there are any lawyers out there who know how that goes. So that's kind of how the story all came to be. And before we jump into questions, I'll just show a couple things I thought were really interesting as I was working on the story. I think I am not able to share my screen.
Okay, so I think, do I make you a co-host? I think maybe that's what I do. Does that ring a bell?
I think so.
Okay, hold on.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, oh, good. We have a professor here from Wharton speaking to me. Now, spotlight, I'm not doing that. Mike, is that up in more? It says recording.
Elizabeth, there are 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner.
Okay, yeah, I know. I'm in there more.
For Catherine.
Recording chat.
Oh, in the upper right-hand corner of Catherine's screen.
Oh, of Catherine's screen. Yeah, but Catherine can't do it. I have to make her, don't I?
No, if you go to Catherine's box in the upper right corner, click on the 3 dots.
Oh.
Oh, no.
Make host.
Yes.
How's make host, Catherine?
That'll work.
Great, that works now.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay, so you can see I need an IT person, but you know.
Awesome. Okay, so you should all see a map now. So one of the things that I thought was really fascinating before I started working on this story, and as I was getting into it, was just what it physically took to get to Yalta. And this is something I've thought a lot about in the months since Russia invaded Ukraine, kind of where this is in the world. The Crimean area and Ukraine kind of being this linchpin that's always been at the struggle between warring empires. And then what it took for Churchill and Roosevelt to get to the Soviet Union at that time, because Stalin wouldn't come any further west because he was terrified about security and refused to leave his own borders and wouldn't meet them anywhere outside the Soviet Union. So Churchill had to fly first 1,300 miles to Malta, where he rendezvoused with FDR, who took a week-long journey by ship across the Atlantic Ocean, where they're still sighting enemy U-boats. And very tragically, of course, a plane carrying experts from the British Foreign Office crashed on the way to Malta, which really cast a shadow over the beginning of the conference. And so they rendezvous at Malta and then have to fly another almost 1,400 miles to Crimea, where they landed in an airfield that is dangerously short for the kinds of planes that they've been flying. They had to fly over islands that had been still occupied by enemy anti-aircraft units, one of which shot up the tail of an advanced plane that had traveled there a few days earlier. And then they had to drive another 8 hours over battle-scarred roads, sometimes at no more than 20 miles an hour, until they finally arrived at Levadia Palace, which is this picture here. And you think of a palace, you think of this really glamorous and beautiful place, especially as it had belonged to the Romanovs and the last Tsar. But it was very much this sort of kind of a microcosm of the Soviet Union itself, where you see this beautiful place and it has this imperial past, but it really is just sort of a facade for that which lies behind the door. You have this palace that has been stripped by the Nazis that have been using it as their Crimean headquarters. When they left, when the Soviets pushed them out just a few months before the Yalta conference, they stripped the palace of everything they could carry, all the furniture, all the lamps, the dishes, the rugs, the art, literally down to the doorknobs, which they could use as scrap metal, which is incredible that the Soviets had just 3 weeks to turn this into a site fit for one of the most important meetings in the 20th century with some of the most notable figures on the planet. And it was a truly Herculean task. But yet, even with all that they had done, some of the things that they didn't manage to evict were the bed bugs, which were everywhere in the palace. Churchill talks about waking up with his feet bitten by bugs. And the answer to this at the time in 1945 was to spray everything with a healthy dose of DDT, which we now know was not a very good idea. So it is just kind of incredible when you think about the conditions that these leaders were willing to put up with in order to have this incredibly important meeting with Stalin that they knew that they had to have in person. The other thing that I thought was so striking as I started working on this was you have this photograph of the leaders. You've got Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, their military advisors behind them. And this is the picture that you always see on the cover of history textbooks, in documentaries about World War II, because it's one of the few that we have of the big three all together. But then there's another picture that nobody sees, which is taken from almost the exact same moment at a slightly different angle, though. And off to the side, you can see two young women. You've got Sarah Churchill and Kathleen Harriman, and Anna Roosevelt was just outside the frame of the shot, but you can see her on newsreel footage of the same scene. And this picture just made me think, of all the people they could have brought with them to serve as their aides at this conference, what was so unique about their daughters' experiences and abilities that made them the perfect partners to be there? But then also, more importantly, we definitely have a tendency to put people like Roosevelt and Churchill on a pedestal where they become more than human and almost hard to relate to on a human level. And yet, at the end of the day, they're also someone's dad. And what would it be like to be their child and to be with them on this precipice between World War and Cold War, knowing that you're living through a historic moment and wanting to record that for your posterity, if only for yourself. And I thought that those were some just really fascinating concepts, kind of framing the story. For me, the story really is about relationships, yes, relationships between nations and relationships between leaders, but most importantly about the relationships between fathers and daughters. And I think sometimes history like this can feel very daunting. You know, the history of diplomacy, geopolitics, at this very high level is not especially relatable to most people in their daily lives, but we all know what it's like to be someone's child, and many people know what it's like to be someone's parent. And that's really what this story is. And so I was really glad to be able to shine a light on that amidst all the geopolitics, of course, that are incredibly important to the story, and profile these three incredible individuals that really had never had a chance to tell their story before. So I'll stop sharing my screen there and turn it over to you, Elizabeth.
Wow, fascinating, just fascinating. So I'm going to ask the first question since I kind of have the microphone, which is lucky, and then we're going to get to as many as we can from the book club, and I'll call on people alphabetically by first name. So my question, Sarah, is you have this incredible research that you've done. Your footnotes are amazing. I wonder how much was the sort of, you know, the research was the skeleton, if you will, because it's fact, a lot of it, I mean, almost all of it. But how much did you have to add that was, you know, in effect, meat on the bones? And did you feel uncomfortable in part creating these young women? Did you like talk to them on high and say, look, is this okay? I'm gonna, you know, I'm gonna imagine a little bit of this, right? How much was which?
Yeah, so I mean, the story, it is nonfiction. It has 100 pages of notes in the back, and it is nonfiction. There's nothing that I've made up. I haven't made up conversations. I haven't made up anyone's feelings. If I said someone was feeling a certain way, it's because they wrote that in a letter or they said that to someone else. And so while it is written more like a novel where I almost want you to forget that you're reading nonfiction because I want it to feel like a story, I didn't make any of it up. It really is all directly from them. And I was really fortunate to have three fantastic primary figures who wrote letters and diaries that I could draw upon. But I was also able to consult people who had known and loved them more than anyone in the world, their families, their colleagues. I had a chance to interview Lady Jane Williams, who is the last surviving secretary of Winston Churchill. She's also the mother of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so she is, you know, has had an incredible lens on the last, 80 years. She's almost 100 now, but kind of 80 adult years. And then the children and nieces and nephews and grandchildren of the daughters and of the leaders. And it's a very personal thing to ask someone, if they're okay to sit for an interview about a story about their mother. And I can imagine how challenging that would be to kind of relinquish those memories to a perfect stranger to then, do with them what they will. But I really appreciated that none of the family members asked for any oversight over the story. They understand the role of the historian is to be objective and impartial. And I tried in every instance to be fair, even though there were certainly different kind of the characters in the stories had competing agendas. Everybody wants their family to look as good as possible, but they really respected the role of the historian. And I'm so grateful that they trusted me. And the conversations I got to have with them were just fascinating, providing that context to their letters, to their diaries, to their memories. And I'll always be so grateful to that. And I'm so fortunate to have now to be, able to call these people my friends, whether that's FDR's granddaughter, who was 18 when Yalta happened, or Kathleen Harriman's sons, who discovered a box of her letters from the time she was in the Soviet Union in her closet after she passed away. It just is really incredible to be able to do that.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's a testament to you that they would open up to you as they did. So all of them, I mean, God, life must be dull for you now. I mean, really.
Hardly. Well, I see Professor Mann has joined us. So I just want to say hi, Professor Mann. I was very fortunate to have his class on property by 1L year, which has tons of history, which I absolutely loved. So thank you so much for that. And I can't believe I'm almost done at HLS. And so I can't possibly say that things are boring now when I'm very fortunate to be a Harvard Law student. Maybe slightly less hectic and I sleep a little bit more than that year, but things are pretty good.
Good. Yeah, no, Bruce, I don't see you, but Bruce Mann is Elizabeth Warren's husband, which is how I know him, but he's a phenomenal history buff and professor at Harvard Law School. So that was a wonderful small world coincidence that you had him. Great. So I'm going to call on people by first name. We'll get to as many as we can. This is fascinating. Ann Snyder is our A. So Ann, are you nearby? Can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for this beautiful book. What a great read. What beautiful writing. So appreciate it. My question is this, is your next book time management? Because I really want to know how you wrote this book while you were in the first year of law school.
Gosh, I'm sure there are many people who have their hands even more full than mine. I mean, fortunately, I don't have any children yet, because I know there are a lot of people who do law school and are parents at the same time. So I don't even know how they do that. But it's like every week I felt like I had to be really disciplined about how I managed my time. 1L is very busy, but almost in a way, when you're busier, you're able to be more organized and to be more focused. And so I'd make sure, I think the trouble with writing a lot of the times, a lot of people who aspire to be writers, they're always saying like, I'll write when I have time, but you're never going to have time. There are always things to fill up the time. And so you really have to treat it like it is a full-time job, and it has to kind of be respected as that. And so I'd get up early before class. I'd have a couple of hours to write in the mornings, and then I'd save out one of the 2 days of the weekend to be only a book day. And so just kind of, I was able to make it work. I was really fortunate to go to a high school called New Trier High School here in Winnetka, Illinois, where it was extremely difficult and very challenging, but taught me the skills of time management better than anything I've ever done in my life. I literally have never been as busy as I was as a high school student until 1L plus book. So I don't know if that's healthy for high school students, but it is what it is. So I was very fortunate to get those life lessons early on.
Can I do one follow-up? Is with all your work on the book, what are you focusing on as a law student? Is there going to be a certain area you're going to practice?
So I am going to go work for Freshfields in Washington, D.C. after I graduate. Freshfields is a great British firm, and they specialize, particularly, they do everything, but one of the things they're most known for is international arbitration. So I've been able to take a number of international law courses, which have been fascinating. And I've been very surprised at the thing I've been really drawn to in law school, is actually law and technology, and where that intersects with longstanding international historical issues. Did not think I'd be into tech at all, being a historian, but I just finished and published a very long paper on Google Maps and the way that they mediate and instigate border disputes, a number of which are very historic in nature. And so kind of history has an interesting way of popping up in the law, kind of where technology introduces novel concepts that haven't been addressed by the law yet. And that kind of leading edge of where the law is going, I find really interesting.
Great, thank you.
Fascinating, fascinating. Oh, Betsy Gemmell, I see you there.
Yeah, I second Ann's comments about your book. I really enjoyed it, and I've recommended it to lots and lots of people.
Thank you.
You're about the same age as Kathy Harriman. Would you have done anything differently about the bed bugs?
Oh my gosh. I mean, Kathy Harriman, so I was 27 when I started working on this, which was the same age as Kathy. I published it when I was 29. Sarah was 30, so just about the same age. And so it was really interesting to be able to kind of have that insight as a girl of that age, kind of what it would be like to be there. I don't know if I'd have the poise that Kathy Harriman had to get up and give a speech in Russian in front of Stalin and some of the most fearsome men in the Soviet Union. But I think it's really a testament to what Averell Harriman saw in his daughter, and this really remarkable partnership that they had, that he, on the one hand, maybe it's odd that he left her there to deal with the Soviets as the middleman between the Soviet and American advance teams, but also how much he respected and trusted her to be able to fulfill that role, almost like a protocol officer at the State Department today, in a way, is kind of how I think about it. I think that there's kind of this odd dichotomy where the Soviets took hospitality incredibly seriously. And on the one hand, they are in a palace and they do provide things like caviar and all sorts of luxuries that no one would ever expect. And yet it is incredibly primitive. And I think given that she'd spent the last year, more than a year, living in Moscow with her father, she had become very used to this dichotomy and being able to kind of work around it. And I think that no one could understand that until they had lived there. And so fortunately, she had lived there and knew kind of how to work within the system. And so if I was in her shoes, hopefully I'd have had some similar experience, but I think it would have been very hard to come in as a complete outsider like Anna Roosevelt and know how to operate within the system.
Do you think there was an
Fascinating.
advantage to learning Russian through French?
I don't know if it was an advantage. I think it certainly speaks to her intelligence and willingness to do whatever it took to be able to get the job done. And I think that one of the things that the Soviets said repeatedly was that how much they respected Averell Harriman, and then kind of by extension his daughter, because they worked very hard to kind of function within the system given the limitations. And that was something that even if they were at odds in worldview, the Soviets really respected about the Harrimans.
Wonderful. Sorry, Betsy, I'm going to move on only because we
Yes.
don't have a lot more time. Unfortunately, Hazel, are you out there somewhere?
I am, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I too love the book. I found myself loving the beginning and the end best. I was just so upset in the middle thinking about Russia. And I wondered, I think you wrote the book really before. I mean, not that Russia has ever been that much fun, but before the Ukraine situation that we're in now. Did finding out about you too? I mean, I just found it so horrible, and the bugging and just the way they are. I'm sorry, I'm very biased, but apparently.
No.
But
Oh, sorry, you're a little broken up. I
Yeah,
don't know.
Hazel, you're broken up. I think we get the question. Basically, a parallel to today.
Mhm.
You're kind of frozen. So, Sarah, why don't you go ahead? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I definitely, there's so many parallels between dealing with Russia today, the Soviets then, and in a way, it's kind of like bookends on a period of time between 1945 and now. And one of the things that I found was so interesting in my research was this letter that was written by George Kennan, who is Averell Harriman's #2 at the embassy in Moscow, writing to Edward Stettinius, who is the Secretary of State, when Stettinius had requested any information in advance about the Soviet bureaucrats that they'd be working with kind of below Stalin. And Kennan writes back and says, unfortunately, I can't provide you with any of the information that you're looking for because any information I have about them and their biographies is probably fake. The real information only comes out in their obituaries when they're no longer of any use to anyone. And don't be persuaded that invitations to dinner or rounds of golf are going to convince them to be any more favorable to your suggestions or interests. All they are able to do is advocate for the interests of the Soviet Union, and their personal opinions are entirely checked at the door. And I thought that was really fascinating. And I think that we have a constant temptation among kind of US senior leadership to try to kind of have this personal outreach to Putin or the Russian or Soviet leader, where, if only you can make this personal breakthrough, things will improve in diplomatic relations between Russia and the West. Unfortunately, that just really never works, including in FDR's case, where even if Stalin liked him and admired him, which I genuinely believed he did, it really didn't matter because that was not useful to the interests and the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. There's always been a paranoia about weakness on the Western flank and the flatlands of Ukraine and Poland being the pathway of invasion going back to the Napoleonic era, used by Napoleon, used by Hitler. And you see that again today. And this view within the Soviet Union and Russia that greatness as a leader akin to that of Peter the Great or Catherine the Great equals territorial expansion. That's the way to become a great leader of Russia. And that is very much what Putin is doing now. It is, as much about his personal legacy as it is about his national interests, perhaps more about his personal legacy than anything. And it was really interesting. I did a semester at the State Department in the spring as part of a Harvard Law School program where I was working in the legal advisor's office, and seeing that kind of unfolding today, kind of this, what will be written about by historians in the future, and thinking back to writing this book was just a really singular experience that I'm really glad to have been able to have.
Wow, fascinating. That was a question I wanted to ask. So brilliant answer and great question. Jane, are you here? Jane was on a train. Jane Pepper, there you are. Good.
train.
apologize for being late, but yes, Amtrak was holding me up. I love this book. Oh, it was
Thank
my
you.
best book of the year. So
Oh,
thank
thank
you.
you so much.
Talk a little bit about the organization, because you kept it going so well from a day perspective, and yet you brought in these wonderful pictures of different people, different situations. How did you put all that together?
Yeah, so the way it kind of was in, I saw the structure in my head. I almost saw like these set pieces, these big moments, these major scenes, almost like a movie in my head, and kind of which were the main cinematic moments that I really wanted to display, where you have a number of people who left records commenting on participating in something like Stalin's banquet, where you have a number of accounts. So there's a lot of really rich detail, which I can draw upon. And it is a very climactic or important moment that moves the story forward. And then the question for me was then how to weave in the backstory to keep the momentum moving forward, kind of this very, almost like a slow burning tragedy where you can see, you know, what's going to happen, especially with Poland, is that tragic through line. And then also kind of this feeling that these daughters have this window of opportunity to be the person of utmost importance to their fathers in these crucial moments. But this is an opportunity where the window is closing as soon as this thing that they're trying so hard to secure is achieved. And so it's bittersweet for them as well. So I wanted to kind of keep that, and also that word relationships really as the backbone of the story. And then so amongst the set pieces, kind of weaving in the backstory of the daughters, their lives, their relationships with their fathers, but then also the geopolitics of kind of where we are in the war. And so I saw those as the linking pieces almost between the set pieces. And so that's how I organized it structurally, moving sequentially kind of day by day, because it really is a week, which was kind of a fairly contained framework for figures that can easily sprawl into all different areas. You know, you're dealing with Churchill or Roosevelt, and you can talk about any number of things with them, but kind of keeping it as tightly around the first person experiences as the daughters as possible helped it become not unwieldy and unruly.
Wow, amazing,
Thank
amazing.
you so much.
How long did it take you to write? I'm just curious. I mean, if you
It was about 3 years, about a year and a half research, about a year and a half
Mhm.
writing, but then of course more research to fill in things that I realized later that I needed to supplement or just do a little bit more work on, but about 3 years.
Wow, amazing. Okay, Linda, are you? Yes, you are. Can you unmute?
Go. Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you so much. You can hear me, Elizabeth?
Yes, yes.
Catherine, like everyone else, I love the book. I found it absolutely fascinating, but I found it a tremendous tragedy that these women of such fabulous talent, intellect, emotional EQ, the contacts they would have through their fathers, and that they went on to not great things in their lives. Anna Roosevelt's story I thought was particularly tragic when she did not even have the courage or the understanding to report the sexual abuse by her husband of her daughter.
Yes.
Catherine Harriman was phenomenal. I mean, she was my absolute all-time favorite. I'm not quite sure what actress you want to have play her, but I mean, she was just phenomenal. 27 years old, and I never saw any 27-year-old until I've met you that had their shit together like she did. She's my French, but. So did that strike you? You were 27 years old. I am going to be 69 on my next birthday. Like you, I'm an attorney. I started the practice of law in 1979 when there were few women in court. I clerked for 2 years in federal court, never saw a woman argue. And yet through my 40-year career in law, I've seen women now, we're in all phases of the practice of law. My area was criminal. Which was late for women to really get involved in that area, particularly in the defense side. But I do see women have come up, they've seized the opportunities, that they made them for themselves, and they went forward. It struck me, and I wonder if it struck you, being much younger than I am, what a tragic loss to the world this was, that these women did not use their talents, their brains, and their connections to do great things.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned Anna Roosevelt being particularly tragic, and so much of the tragedy I felt with her was in the way that her own father treated her. You have FDR, who's really known as a champion for women's rights. His incredible partnership with Eleanor did so much for women, and yet in his treatment of his daughter and his wife, that really is not a progressive sort of father. That she has to find out from her father's mistress how much he loved and appreciated her, because he never told her himself. That's horrible.
I cried. I
Yes,
cried.
me
At
too.
that part of the book, I cried.
Writing about Anna was really quite heartbreaking. I had to kind of just stop and sit back sometimes and just address how sad I felt for her. And then, of course, with her daughter, and her daughter conveying that to me shortly after Me Too really started. She just called me one day after I'd interviewed her to tell me her story. And it's kind of one of those things, once you know it, you can't unknow it. And so it has to go in the book. And how does that fit in with the rest of Anna's life and her story? And the one that I felt almost kind of, if you take it just on professional grounds, that I think had so much to offer and really didn't have an opportunity to do anything with it, was Sarah Churchill, because I think more than any of her siblings, she was really the one who had so many of her father's gifts, that she had the temperament and the intellect to follow him in politics. Acting is very much like diplomacy or politics.
Yes.
And she really had a knack for that. And if she had been born 10 years later, she would have been a contemporary of Margaret Thatcher. And so even 10 years difference might have made her think that she could have done other things with her life and maybe followed her father and continued his legacy. Kathy Harriman did have some professional opportunities as a war reporter and journalist after the war, which was wonderful. But she genuinely loved being a mother, raising her sons. She was an outdoors woman and competitor, great athlete, competitive skier her entire life. And so I think she could have continued in that if she wanted to, but she really truly loved, those passions and her children. And it is a personal choice, of course. But I think, especially for Sarah Churchill, that she could have had this incredible political
she became
future.
she became an alcoholic.
Which is so sad. And I think sometimes people see that as like, here's another not successful child of a famous person. And yet she suffered so many personal tragedies in her life. Almost all the people closest to her died in quick succession, and she really never recovered from that, which is so heartbreaking. Many of them due to suicide, which is something that really all three of them experienced. And you can see so much the legacy of the unaddressed mental health issues from World War II that we now understand so much better. And even if that had been addressed, what other things might have been able to have been achieved. It really is a tragedy. And yet I'm glad through the story that people are able to appreciate them and understand them and their gifts kind of early in life. For them to speak for themselves and leave for their own legacy.
Yeah, and actually gratitude. I mean, this is a group of women. I didn't tell you about us, but they're highly professional. Not quite in your league, but we're highly.
No, I am aspiring to everything that you've achieved as I look ahead to balancing writing and law and figuring out.
Amazing.
Well,
I'll come to you for advice.
No. Well, I'm just saying, in a way, the silver lining is we can be
She's
grateful.
asked a question.
We can be grateful that we live now, and that we were sort of built on
That's
their shoulders.
Elizabeth Vale.
So can you all mute if you're not talking? Yeah. Anyway, Lisa Stokes, are you out there?
Oh, Lisa Stokes.
I am. And thank you, Catherine. Also one of my favorite books, not just of the year, but probably of the decade.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
Really such a fascinating study of personalities and relationships during such a traumatic time that many of our parents lived through. So I guess my question sort of follows on Linda's. Was there anybody who, through your research and interviews, was a real surprise to you?
I think the most surprising thing was kind of this revelation later in the research stage of Anna's daughter coming to me with her story about what she had experienced with her stepfather, and the way that Anna handled or did not handle that. That was the really most surprising thing, that it doesn't fit within the timeline of the story, but it is kind of within Anna's story of that moment. So how to weave that in and do so fairly and sensitively, but also kind of within the balance of the story without making it feel like it was this jarring separate thing, because it was something that was interwoven with Anna's life as all of this was unfolding, and doing it in a respectful way. Where there are certainly other members of the family that would have been uncomfortable with that kind of a revelation.
Roosevelt.
So that was probably the most difficult moment specifically, that made me really think about kind of
Anna Roosevelt's
what
one
is
of the
the
daughters.
appropriate role of the historian in kind of portraying that in the most honest and fair way.
Fascinating. Margaret Ralph, who is a history teacher and taught European history to me
Amazing.
and others, fabulous teacher.
And my question, very much like Linda and Lisa's, so I'll be quick. I was really impressed with how I could not tell if you had a favorite. And I wondered if you knew the ends before you really began to write this, the ends of their lives, because the two suicides for Sarah, one suicide for John, and for Anna, and then Kathy found her husband, I gather, about to shoot himself with a rifle and succeeded in stopping it.
He did actually shoot himself, and she was able to care for him immediately. Unfortunately, it wasn't as bad as the others, but yes, all of them experienced it.
I would think, how often, that's a lot of suicides for 3 women that you hadn't even begun to study. So I'm wondering, did you know the ends of their lives when you started?
Yeah, and some of them I was more aware of the details than others when I started, and I had such respect for them, and they were each such different characters and such different voices, and it's like I could never pick a favorite, because that'd be like picking your favorite child. Especially Sarah Churchill's sad end of life with her alcoholism, kind of never quite breaking through as an actress in the way that she might have, and another kind of had things gone better for her. So kind of this legacy of like, she's the failure child, like, and that once you get to know her, that's not who she is. And for Anna and Sarah, those tragedies were very public. And what was, I thought, really touching is, even though these daughters didn't walk away from the Yalta Conference the best of friends, that there was this shared experience that they had where they were the only people in the world who knew what it was like to be them. And you have Anna writing to Sarah after her husband committed suicide, saying, I know what it's like to have your pain in the public eye. And that's just was so touching. And so I almost had to kind of like set that tragic end of life aside. And it was like this looming thing that was out there that I knew I had to address at some point. But also you have to almost forget that, because they didn't know any of that was coming yet. And so how do you write them as who they were at that moment without kind of bringing what I knew into coloring what they may have been feeling or not when they didn't know what was coming for them. So that's one of those things.
I appreciate that decision, because it meant we all just savored what they were doing while they were there, and then whoomp at the end. But I'm glad I didn't know it. I'm glad you didn't at the beginning say, I just want to say, by the way, here's what happened.
Yes.
It was a smaller part, very small part of your book, and really wasn't the point. So
well, that's the tricky thing about being a historian or writing nonfiction, that you can't give everybody the happy ending that you'd like, because things really happened. And it doesn't all work out neatly, but this is life. This is what everyone deals with. And I think that, knowing that even these people dealt with many of the things that so many of us deal with, kind of just goes to show that there really is this common human experience.
Yeah.
Boy, I wonder if you're ever going to meet them through the pearly gates. I bet they're going to love you, but that was pretty
That's the
fascinating.
irony of being a historian. You spend all this time getting to know every detail about these people so intimately, and yet you never meet them.
Yeah. Do you think you will make a film of it, or will someone?
Yeah, so movie things are actually happening right now. Unfortunately, I can't really share any details, but things are clicking along. So that's very exciting.
Yay.
So hopefully in the not too distant future, Daughters of Yalta coming to a screen near you.
Well, eventually, I hope you'll be in it, but don't tell us anything.
I'm happy to be, starving Russian peasant by the side of the road, number 3.
Or just spraying the bed bugs or something. Yeah.
Producing would be fun though.
Yeah, that's exciting. Nancy Roberts.
I think you can hear me now. Is that correct?
Yep.
Great. So I actually listened to this book twice on Audible. And my favorite part is getting to know these people as human beings, everybody. I hope it's not an incendiary comment or question, but did you, in your research, did you feel that Roosevelt knew that the Jews were being slaughtered and that there were concentration camps, and then he turned a blind eye, similarly to how he wouldn't deal with Poland and many other issues.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that most surprised me during this research, I kind of had almost a somewhat of a reevaluation of Roosevelt throughout. I still completely believe he was a phenomenal president, especially domestically. He really understood domestic politics, but some of the things that made him a great domestic politician didn't necessarily serve him as well in foreign policy, especially dealing with Stalin. And the thing that most surprised me about the discussions at Yalta was that the Holocaust and the Jews, they didn't come up at all, except for a very distasteful joke that FDR made in a private dinner with Churchill and Stalin towards the end of the conference. That was shocking to me. I was really stunned by that. They certainly knew if not everything, quite a bit by then. The Soviets had discovered the first concentration camp in September 1944. And so that they knew what was coming if they hadn't found it already. And I really was quite shocked that that was not at all a part of the discussion. And I think it should have been. And so that's one of the things. It's kind of, you step back and, it's none of these people are perfect. There are definitely things, they're all flawed like every individual, but the lack of attention on the Holocaust, especially from FDR, especially given some of the conversations that he had with his cabinet and internally and privately, that wasn't on the agenda at Yalta, I thought was really stunning.
You think it's because they were anti-Semitic, or what? Do you think it was because his purpose wasn't being served by addressing that?
I think there definitely was a lot. I don't think FDR was actively anti-Semitic, but there was a lot of casual and passive anti-Semitism, or things that people wouldn't have called anti-Semitism then that we definitely would call anti-Semitism today. So I think that there was kind of a baseline worldview that I wish was different about him, if not actively anti-Semitic. But I think he was very good at compartmentalizing what he needed to get from different people at different times and what he felt he needed to prioritize at different times. And for him, his objectives at the Yalta conference were really two. These were the Soviet entry into the war against Japan. That was absolutely essential to him. He wanted to save as many American lives as possible, which of course is very admirable. And in doing so, he needed to give Stalin territorial concessions. And so he projected this would be a very difficult negotiation, and he only had so many chips. And the other thing was his really personal legacy of kind of securing peace for the future, and succeeding where Woodrow Wilson had failed with the League of Nations by creating the United Nations as really the way to kind of continue this alliance after the common enemy had been defeated, and to bring the Soviet Union into the international community once the war was over. And I think that he saw that as kind of superseding any of the other individual issues, that once you have the structure to bring nations of the world together to discuss the most pressing issues of the day, all of those discussions would happen. And by creating the forum for those conversations, that was kind of the overarching goal that would allow all the other problems to be solved. And so I think that's how he saw it and was able to kind of rationalize it in his mind.
Fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're actually doing pretty well in time, so I'm going to be bad and sneak in a quick related question. Do you think if FDR died 3 months or 2 months before, instead of when he died 2 months later, that if we'd had Truman, the outcome would have been different, the dynamic would have been different?
I think the dynamic would have been different. And I think Truman probably would have been a little bit more adversarial to the Soviets. He certainly was. Just 8 weeks later, he was very adversarial with Molotov when he came over for the opening of the United Nations in San Francisco. And yet, I don't know how much would have been different at Yalta itself, because in order for things to have been materially different, it kind of creates this domino effect of other decisions that would have had to have been different. In order for Poland to have come out differently, Britain and the US would have had to have opened the Western Front considerably earlier, which meant that Britain would have had to have started rearmament much earlier, and the US military industrial complex would have had to have started a lot earlier. And so then you're getting into decisions that were made in the 1930s. And so it's kind of like, you kind of can't separate any one factor. I do think that if FDR wasn't as sick, he might have been a little bit more clear-eyed about Stalin, or would have been able to kind of had the capacity to hear what Churchill was warning about.
Mhm.
but yet it also kind of didn't suit his worldview at the time. And he really saw this breakthrough with Stalin as the linchpin to everything else that needed to happen,
Mhm.
and very much saw that Britain and Churchill were the past. And so if he was in better health, maybe things like repatriation of POWs was something he really could have put his foot down more on, especially with the Soviets that knew that they would be killed if they were sent back to the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
Maybe that's an area where they could have come
Mhm.
to a more favorable agreement. But on the
Mhm.
big ones, I don't
Mhm.
know.
Fascinating. Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, Pam Russell.
Yes, hi. I'm also a big fan of your book, read it actually several times. But I
thank you.
wanted to also make one other comment. My mother graduated from New Trier High School, and my grandfather
wow.
was a biology teacher and the swim coach. But anyway,
No way.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
well, I wanted to, obviously, this is a huge amount of research, and I would guess a lot of it comes from diaries, letters, and like the letter I was so just moved by was the letter from Lucy to Anna. It was a beautifully written letter, and that's where, to me, a lot of how we get to know who these people really were. So going forward as a historian, where everything's email, text messaging, and I wonder where we're going to go as far as trying to
Barney, look at this.
describe characters, people as they really are.
Yeah, I think that this is something I think about a lot as a historian. I'm very fortunate the area that I work in, there are a number of letters and diaries and things are well preserved, and there are meeting notes, especially dealing with kind of diplomatic cables and government meetings. But I actually take a lot of heart from the people who work on ancient history, where you have so few sources and they're able to reconstruct so much and tell us so much about the past. Someone like Stacy Schiff writing about Cleopatra, really incredible work. And she's able to glean a ton. And it just takes a different skill set to mine that kind of information and those types of sources. And that gives me confidence that people will be able to do that when writing about our own times. It'll take different skills and different training, and you'll be interpreting different sources. And almost we have the opposite problem now, where it's like too much information that you could go back and reconstruct everybody's life kind of minute by minute with their text messages and their emails and everything, but kind of how authentic is that? You're not having to sit back and reflect on the day in your diary or in a letter to your mother or your sister. And so it's different, but I do think that, we will adapt our skills to be able to deal with the sources we have, just as people who write about the very, very historic past have been able to do with so few sources. So that's my optimistic view of the state of the field of history going forward.
Oh, that's very hopeful. How nice. Okay, great question, Pam. Reggie, are you there, Reggie Thomas?
Well, a lot of my questions, several different questions have been posed, but 2 points. One is I also love the book, adored the book. And just to show you the impact of the book, I went for a walk this afternoon with 2 friends not connected to this book club in any way. I brought the book, they had both read it. And the entire walk we spent discussing it.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
It was like an hour and a half walk. And we went where we talked about Ukraine, Poland, just such a relationship.
Thank you, love.
One thing we talked about. We talked about so much. So that number one. Since
Thank
so
you
much, since much has been explored, let me veer off towards the movie, only because many of my other questions.
The front seat has stuff.
Hang on a sec. Nancy, can you mute yourself? We can hear you.
I'm sorry. Oh, gosh, I'm sorry.
So if you could control the movie, and no writer of any book can, what would you, in your dream, would you want them to focus on, and what would you want them not to focus on? Not to emphasize. For example, one of the things that affected me so much was not just how awful the end was for all those women, which was tragic, that they had such a bad ending. It's unusual for so many people to have such a bad ending with their spouses, but they also had that sort of not a good beginning with their fathers. Avril Cameron, wonderful man, but he really wasn't much of a father. He was a friend. Roosevelt totally ignored and dismissed Anna. Even Sarah had it was only towards much later in life that she was able to get a relationship with him. So they didn't, their relationship with the fathers as well as their relationship with their husbands fraught, which is sort of a bookended tragedy. But what would you like to go back to the movie? What would you like them to?
Nancy, will you get off
Yeah.
your goddamn?
I think what I would really love, I think there's a temptation, and I completely understand where it's coming from, and it's very important. It's a very important conversation to have. But I think there's a tendency to kind of take the questions that we're really pondering about our own times and kind of import those and layer them onto different times and kind of put a today's spin on a story of yesterday. And so I think kind of the way that we think about kind of women's empowerment and feminism now is not how they would have talked about it then. And so I think there's a way for the story to be part of that conversation, but still be true to the history and the way that they would have seen it. And so that's kind of one of the things I want to be mindful of. And I don't see it as a story where, like, if only we'd listened to the daughters, you know, there would have been no Cold War. And like, that's not what the story is, but there is kind of a temptation to maybe kind of cast it in that light, which very fortunately, I don't think that's where it's going. It's, you know, has never been part of the conversation. I think the people who are involved in it are very sensitive to and deal in really great, interesting period pieces that are true to the history while kind of laying the question out there unsaid about how it relates to the present. And I think that's similar with also avoiding the temptation of saying, this is exactly like Russia today. Yes, it's very similar, but without kind of making it, these are the exact same. And so there's a way of kind of having them part of the conversation, but not being today's conversation, if that makes sense. One thing that I would really love, and this is like totally trivial, but if I can have my way in casting of just even one person, I absolutely want Averil Harriman to be played by John Hamm.
Well, you should be able to get your way. Tell them what's the deal.
That's the one. That's the one thing that I'll die in the hill for.
That's wonderful. Okay, Susan Schmidt. Nancy, your dog, dear. Now we can hear your dog.
You know what? I'm sorry. I'm gonna get off.
Well, don't do that, dear. Just mute yourself. Okay, Susan.
Catherine, I'm joining in everyone else who loved your book. I read it on my vacation and I couldn't put it down, and it was just great. Other people asked a lot of my questions, so I want to ask you, if I may, about the absence of Stalin's daughter.
Yeah.
Did you learn anything about that and what type of father he was?
Yes, he was his relationship with his daughter was very different from these other fathers, where they were quite ahead of their time and bringing their daughters to be their aides. And Churchill was almost the most feminist of the three fathers. He really valued his wife and his daughters, and they were very much his privy council. Stalin, on the other hand, totally different story. His daughter Svetlana had a very difficult relationship with him. She found out when she was a teenager that her mother had committed suicide and was really driven to it by Stalin's cruelty. She then rebelled and started an affair with a significantly older and married Soviet Jewish cinematographer who Stalin did not like, partly because he was Jewish, and he then exiled him to Siberia, put him in a gulag. Svetlana then rebelled again, and when she went to university, she fell in love with and then married, against her father's wishes, a fellow student named Grigory Morozov, who is also Jewish, which Stalin really took exception to. At the time of Yalta, Svetlana was 19, newly married, pregnant with her first child. Stalin refused to ever meet his son-in-law, and so things were very bad at the time. But what was really interesting was that Svetlana did speak English, and she could have been a daughter diplomat, perhaps, in a way like these other daughters were. But Stalin really didn't want her to interact with foreigners, with several exceptions. There was one time when Churchill went to Moscow in 1942 to meet with Stalin, and he brought Svetlana out around dinner time, almost like a prop to kind of show Churchill, oh, look, I'm this family man too, which is very odd and uncomfortable. And Svetlana exchanged a few words in English with Churchill, and Churchill said to Svetlana, oh, yeah, you remind me so much of my own redheaded daughter, Sarah. And so Svetlana then sent a brooch to Sarah as kind of this gesture of daughter-to-daughter diplomacy, which Sarah then wore on her uniform throughout the duration of the conference, kind of as a gesture to the daughter that wasn't there, which I thought was really poignant.
Story. Thank you.
Fascinating. Okay, Tildy's our last person. Tildy, are you out there?
I am, and I've got like lots of questions. So you just
Okay.
turned me off, Elizabeth, when the
Yeah,
so
I will.
my
I'll just
questions
mute
all
you.
come from reading reviews of your book, and I'm hoping you'll give response to some of the things I wanted to hear your answer to. So for instance, Betsy Gemmell brought up the facilities. I read that Stalin intentionally limited the number of bathrooms to make it comfortable for his friends. Is that true? Do you think that was true? You didn't mention that. I know.
I mean, I don't know that it was directed by Stalin. I think there were a lot of things that they did to make their visitors feel uncomfortable, but they were actually very genuine when it came to hospitality. They really tried to go out of their way, sometimes very odd ways that you really would not expect. This is something that Kathy Harriman really encountered numerous times. Like there was no glass in a number of the windows in the building where they lived and worked. And yet here were like these fresh flowers on her desk every day. You know, it's like these things that no one would expect in the middle of the war. And so I don't think that they would do things like deliberately to be inhospitable, but there were definitely just like different standards of hygiene and accommodation and comfort in the Soviet Union that they wouldn't have thought to have like gone out of their way to provide the Western version of it in the way that they did with some of the food. Like they tried to create like cream of wheat and it just like was not good because it had like butter and garlic in it. And that's not what people eat for breakfast in the West. And they did like build temporary bathrooms, which were basically just like latrines in the garden. And so I think there were other ways they tried to throw people off balance. I don't know that the bathrooms specifically were deliberately meant to be that. I think they just were working with very limited resources.
If Elizabeth will, and you allow me one more, another reviewer said, and this was an Amazon reviewer, that you were very gentle with Kathleen's actual romantic activities and that two, what are they, NKVD guys got killed, executed by Stalin for the relationship with her.
Yeah,
Your
I never
response.
found any actual historical evidence of this. You know, your imagination can certainly go many places, and there are rumors about things, but I really couldn't put anything in that wasn't completely substantiated in the historical record. Yes, we do know about her fling. I wouldn't even call it a full-fledged affair, but certainly fling with FDR Jr., somewhat facilitated by Harry Hopkins. And Kathy was very constrained in who she could interact with. I never saw her writing about liaisons with Russian men in her letters to her sister or Pamela, and she was really frank with them. There were people that she'd try to go and talk to and like sit with and chat with at the ballet or at a concert to practice her Russian. I just didn't see anything in the historical record that would substantiate that, but it's certainly possible.
Elizabeth, do I get one more?
Okay, tell it quick.
Quickly. And so one reviewer said you should have gone to more Soviet sources to give their side of their opinion of the three women. Some documents of Yalta from Russia was released just before your book was released. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that and what you think about that comment from that nasty reviewer, but he liked your book, as did I, by the way.
Well, my favorite unkind review is someone told me in the review on Amazon that this book had too much about the Yalta conference in it. It's in the title. So if that's not what you were looking for, maybe you should have chosen a different book.
That's hilarious.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the things that's really frustrating is that you'll finish a book, all the manuscripts will be in, it's in formatting, and then like this new source comes out that you would have loved to have read. It's like, darn, very frustrating. Everybody does the best of what they can with the resources they have. There's a temptation to research forever. You have to kind of know when to cut yourself off. The story also wasn't driven by a Soviet protagonist per se. And so there was kind of things that the daughters would have been privy to that would be their first person experience. And some of that is a little bit outside of it. But I was very fortunate to be able to have access to a number of things that had just been translated into English from Soviet sources, like the Soviet ambassador to Britain's diaries. My dissertation supervisor at Cambridge, David Reynolds, worked with a Russian historian on a number of translations of key Soviet government documents that they released. And then I also had a chance to get to know the granddaughter of the official Soviet photographer at the conference. Through the Churchill family, they put me in touch with her, and I was able to have access to some photographs that had really never been seen outside of his work kind of at the time. Certainly had never been included in a book published in the West, which was really interesting. And I really appreciate her giving me access to those and kind of seeing that Soviet eye, kind of physically, kind of that lens of the camera as the Soviets saw it and portrayed it in their own press through his accounts with the camera, and then his own remarks back to his family. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know, what he was being told. He was said to pack and we're leaving tomorrow. He thought he may be executed, but no, he was going to photograph the Yalta conference. And so some of these things are really fascinating. You'd love to be able to mine every single document out there, but sometimes it doesn't always work that way. And then that's what further editions are, where you could supplement things here and there. So, yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, Jill,
Okay,
that's
that's it.
enough.
Thank you.
Free. Catherine, you have been amazing. We have gone a little bit over, but I just want to say two things. Huge thank you to you. I mean, you have really, we sound ridiculous like sycophants, but it's all genuine. We're just captivated by you and your book. So thank you. You have to keep writing. I know you're going to a law firm, but like, no, you can do that, but you must keep writing. And so my first set, I have two little quick things. One, what are you doing next? Can you tell us anything?
Yes, so I am in the beginning of researching what I would like to be my next book. Kind of with this one, I went into it thinking it was actually going to be a biography of Sarah Churchill. And then as I did more research, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, it's Sarah, but it's also these other two. So I kind of want to give myself enough open-mindedness to be able to kind of be guided by the sources as I go through them. But looking at a story right now set in the late 1930s, actually before Munich, and kind of, I like these slice of time stories where you see a window onto the world, where you have a particular moment that brings together unique characters that wouldn't all be in the same room together. So something along those lines.
We'll be on the edge of our chair. And the only problem with you is you've set the bar so high that, I mean, good luck meeting it. I guess you of all people can. And my last comment is, you must visit us on the way to Washington. We are halfway between Cambridge and DC. I think you have a geography. So we would love to, just even have an hour and take you to dinner and spoil you and tell you.
That would be lovely. You're so kind. Thank you so much. And if you make your way up to Boston this spring, please let me know. And I'd love to say hello. And if not, then sometime in Philadelphia.
Great. And we're going to be waiting for that movie too. So yeah, you got a big fan club down here.
I'll tell them to get on with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Fabulous.
And good luck in your legal career also.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Mann, for joining in too. Thank you for having me.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.